In the bustling city of Wari, a place filled with the sounds of markets and cars, there lived a beautiful couple, Mr. and Mrs. Amezie. They had been married for 10 years, yet no child had come into their lives. They loved each other deeply, but the pain of not having a child cast a shadow over their happiness. Over the years, the Amezie couple had visited countless hospitals, herbalists, and churches in Delta State. Each time they were told, "Nothing is wrong with either of you." Frustrated but hopeful, they kept searching. One Saturday morning, a longtime friend of theirs, Yemi, came to visit from Ogun State. After a cup of tea and some small talk, Yemi spoke seriously. "I know someone who can help you," Yemi said, leaning forward. "Who?" Mr. Amezie asked eagerly, hope flashing in his eyes. "There is a woman in Ijebu Ode, Mama Ijebu. She has helped many women get pregnant. My neighbor went there last year, and now she is expecting twins." Mrs. Amezie turned to Yemi and grabbed her hand. "Please, take us to her." The following week, the three of them, Mr. Amezie, Mrs. Amezie, and Yemi, set out for Ijebu Ode. When they arrived at Mama Ijebu's massaging home in Ijebu Ode, they were surprised to see a crowd of women sitting on wooden benches outside the compound. Some were heavily pregnant, while others looked like they had been searching for solutions, just like Mrs. Amezie. The sun was hot, and Mr. Amezie wiped his forehead as they waited. After a few hours, the wooden gate opened, and out walked Mama Ijebu, an elderly woman with a white scarf tied around her head. The women all stood up to greet her with respect. However, as soon as Mama Ijebu's eyes met Mrs. Amezie's, her expression changed. She froze for a moment, then bowed down, saying, "Welcome, my queen, what brings you to my humble home?" Mr. Amezie and Yemi exchanged confused looks. "Queen," they whispered to each other. Mama Ijebu straightened up and said, "Everyone should go and come back tomorrow. I have important visitors today." The other women murmured as they left, but Mama Ijebu was firm. She led the Amezie couple and Yemi into a small, clean room with mats on the floor. "You will sleep here tonight," she said warmly, arranging the space for them. That night, while Mrs. Amezie and Yemi were asleep, Mr. Amezie could not close his eyes. He turned to his wife and whispered, "Do you know that woman?" Mrs. Amezie shook her head, half asleep. Confused and restless, Mr. Amezie got up and stepped outside. He found Mama Ijebu sitting under a tree, grinding herbs. "Can I join you?" he asked. Mama Ijebu nodded. "Sit down." For a long moment, there was silence. Then Mama Ijebu spoke softly. "I know why you are here." Mr. Amezie stared at her, puzzled. Mama Ijebu looked him in the eye. "Your wife cannot bear you children, because she is already married to my king." Mr. Amezie's heart skipped a beat. "Your king?" he repeated. "Yes," Mama Ijebu said. "Your wife is not from this world. She belongs to a spiritual kingdom, a place where I also come from. In that kingdom, she is married and has 4 children." Mr. Amezie began to tremble. "But how can this be?" Mama Ijebu continued, "I was a servant in that kingdom. We were attacked one day by a powerful enemy. Everyone scattered. I escaped, and I suspect your wife escaped, too. But as long as my king is alive, she will never bear children for you." Tears rolled down Mr. Amezie's face as he remembered the strange dreams he often had, a man warning him to release his wife. And how his wife always talk while asleep, and also how a force always throw him off each time he wants to be intimate with her. "Is there no solution?" he asked. Mama Ijebu shook her head. "The only solution is to let her go." After the shocking revelation, Mr. Amezie sat outside, his heart heavy and his mind racing. How could the woman he loved so dearly be part of a spiritual kingdom, and worse, married to another man, no, a king, he had never seen? He sat in silence for a long time, watching the stars twinkle faintly in the night sky. Mama Ijebu was quiet, letting him process everything she had said. Finally, Mr. Amezie stood up. "Thank you, Mama Ijebu," he muttered, his voice shaking. He slowly walked back to the room where his wife and Yemi were fast asleep. When he entered the room, he stopped at the door and looked at Mrs. Amezie. She lay peacefully on the mat, her face serene, unaware of the storm in her husband's heart. "Who is this woman I married?" he thought to himself. His legs felt weak as he sat beside her. Sleep refused to come. He kept hearing Mama Ijebu's words echoing in his ears. "She cannot bear you children, because she is married to my king." The next morning, Yemi woke up first. She stretched and smiled, happy that they had finally come to a place where there might be hope. "Good morning, Uncle," she greeted Mr. Amezie cheerfully. Mr. Amezie nodded, forcing a smile. He hadn't slept a wink, and his eyes were red and puffy. Mrs. Amezie woke up a little later, yawning softly. "Good morning, my husband," she said with a gentle smile. Mr. Amezie looked at her, struggling to respond. She was so beautiful, yet now he saw her differently. He whispered back, "Good morning." Just then, Mama Ijebu entered the room. She greeted them and handed over some food, hot yam porridge with palm oil and fish. "Eat," she said warmly, "you have a long journey ahead." Yemi clapped her hands excitedly. "Mama Ijebu, are you ready to help us today?" she asked. Mama Ijebu sighed. "Sit down. I need to speak to all of you." They gathered around her as she sat on a low wooden stool. Mama Ijebu looked at each of them carefully, her face serious. "Mr. Amezie," she began, "I told you last night that your wife is not from this world. She is married to my king in the spiritual kingdom." Mrs. Amezie frowned, confused. "What are you talking about, Mama? Which king? I don't understand." Mama Ijebu shook her head sadly. "My queen, you may not remember because you were brought here against your will. But you are part of a powerful kingdom beneath the rivers, and your husband there has been searching for you." Mrs. Amezie gasped, holding her chest. "Mama, this cannot be true. My husband is here. He is sitting right beside me." Yemi, who had been quiet, whispered, "Is this why you don't have children, Auntie?" Tears filled Mrs. Amezie's eyes as she looked at her husband. "I don't know anything about this, I swear." Mama Ijebu continued, "It is not your fault, my queen. But as long as my king is alive, you cannot bear another man's child." Mr. Amezie's hands trembled as he asked, "What can we do? Is there a solution?" Mama Ijebu sighed deeply. "There is only one way, you must let her go." "What does that mean?" Mr. Amezie asked, his voice breaking. "You must set her free so she can return to where she belongs. If you don't, you will remain childless forever, and you will never have peace." The room fell silent. That evening, as they prepared to leave Mama Ijebu's home, Mr. Amezie's heart was heavy with confusion and pain. Could he really let go of the woman he loved? As they walked toward the car, Mama Ijebu called out to him. "Think carefully, my son. You must decide soon. If not, the consequences will be worse than you can imagine." Throughout the journey back to Wari, the car was silent. Even Yemi, who was usually chatty, said nothing. When they got home, Mr. Amezie sat outside, staring into the night. Mrs. Amezie came to him and held his hand. "My husband, what is wrong? Do you believe everything that woman said?" Mr. Amezie looked into her eyes, his heart breaking. "I don't know what to believe anymore. That night, as Mr. Amezie tried to sleep, the dream returned. In his dream, he saw a tall, powerful man dressed in royal garments, standing in a river palace. "Release my wife," the man said, his voice echoing like thunder. Mr. Amezie woke up drenched in sweat, his heart pounding. He turned to look at his wife, who was once again speaking softly in her sleep, her words sounding like a language he did not understand. The decision he feared could no longer be delayed. The days after Mr. Amezie's dream were filled with inner turmoil. He couldn't shake the image of the man in the river palace, demanding the release of his wife. Every time he closed his eyes, the dream returned, more vivid than before. The voice of the man echoed in his mind like a constant reminder of the choice he had to make. Meanwhile, Mrs. Amezie remained blissfully unaware of her husband's growing dread. She continued to care for him, and even Yemi, who had come to stay with them for a few days, noticed a change in Mr. Amezie's behavior. He no longer smiled as often, and his eyes were distant. One evening, as they sat down to dinner, Mrs. Amezie asked, "Is something wrong, my husband? You haven't been yourself lately." Mr. Amezie stared at his plate, unable to look her in the eye. He wanted to tell her everything, but the fear of what it might mean held him back. "I'm just tired, my love," he replied softly. "I've been thinking about a lot of things." But Mrs. Amezie wasn't convinced. She reached across the table and took his hand. "If something is bothering you, please tell me. You know I'm here for you." Her warm touch broke through his defenses. For a moment, he considered telling her the truth. But then the image of the man in the dream appeared in his mind again. He knew deep down that the truth would destroy everything they had built together. The following morning, Mr. Amezie decided to visit Mama Ijebu once again. He needed to understand more about the king, about his wife's past, and about what would happen if he made the wrong decision. He arrived at Mama Ijebu's home, feeling the weight of his decision bearing down on him. The elderly woman greeted him with a knowing look, as though she had been waiting for him. "You've come to ask for more answers," she said softly. Mr. Amezie nodded, his throat tight. "I need to know everything, Mama. What happens if I don't let her go?" Mama Ijebu sighed deeply and motioned for him to sit. "If you don't let her go, you will continue to live a life of torment. The man in your dreams, he is your wife's true husband, and as long as he lives, she will not bear your children. You will be trapped in a cycle of pain, unable to find peace." Mr. Amezie closed his eyes, his heart sinking. "And if I let her go?" "You will be free," Mama Ijebu replied, her voice calm. "But it will not be easy. Your wife will return to her true home, and you will never see her again. You will live a long life, but it will be without the woman you love." The choice felt impossible, and yet it was clear. He could not fight the truth of Mama Ijebu's words. When he got to Wari, he went to Mrs. Amezie and sat down beside her. She looked up from what she was preparing and said to him, "Welcome, my love, how was your trip?" "It was fine, my queen," he replied, using the words that Mama Ijebu had said. For a moment, he hesitated, but he knew that it was time. "There is something I need to tell you," he said, his voice trembling. Mrs. Amezie frowned, sensing the seriousness in his tone. "What is it, my husband?" "Please, sit with me," Mr. Amezie said, his voice heavy. As she sat down beside him, he took her hand and looked into her eyes. "I've learned something that will change our lives forever." Mrs. Amezie's eyes widened in concern. "What are you talking about?" He paused, gathering the strength to say the words. "I must let you go." She stared at him in shock. "What do you mean, let me go?" "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "But I have no choice. You belong to another man, a king, from another world. Mrs. Amezie stood up, her face pale. No, this can't be true. This cannot be happening. Mr. Amezie stood up as well, his own face filled with tears. I love you with all my heart, but I must do this, for your peace and mine. You must go back to your true home. Please, don't say this, Mrs. Amezie begged, clutching his arms. I don't remember anything you are saying. I don't understand. Yemi, who had overheard, came running to them. She looked between them, her face filled with worry. Uncle, what is going on? With tears streaming down his face, Mr. Amezie turned to Yemi and said, I'm sorry, but the truth has come to light. Your friend cannot stay here. She must go back to where she belongs. That afternoon, Mr. Amezie took Mrs. Amezie's hand and led her to the riverbank, where Mama Ijebu had promised to meet them. The air was thick with sorrow, and the world seemed to hold its breath. As they reached the water, Mama Ijebu appeared from the shadows. She looked at the couple, her eyes sad but understanding. Are you ready? She asked Mr. Amezie. He nodded, his heart breaking. I'm ready. Mama Ijebu stepped forward and whispered something to Mrs. Amezie in a language Mr. Amezie could not understand. Mrs. Amezie's eyes fluttered, and for a moment, it seemed as though a great weight lifted from her shoulders. I am sorry, my queen, Mr. Amezie whispered, as he watched the woman he loved begin to step into the river. She smiled at him one last time, before disappearing into the water. As the months passed, the pain in Mr. Amezie's heart began to subside, but he never forgot the love they had shared. He returned to his work, and life slowly regained some normalcy. Though he lived a long life, Mr. Amezie never remarried. He knew deep down that his true love would always remain in his heart, even if she was no longer by his side. And every so often, when the night was quiet and the stars shone brightly, he would think back to the woman he had once called his queen. Mr. Amezie's story reminds us that no matter how deeply we love someone, or hold dear to something, we should be able to let go if it will cost us our lives. If you enjoyed this story, please don't forget to share, comment, and most importantly subscribe. Thanks for watching. See you in my next video.